my favorite podcast of all time is Econ Talk by Russ Roberts. He's the author of Wild Problems, and he just published this book, which is basically a contemplation on how to approach the hardest problems in life, which often don't have clear answers. I wanted to share today just some of my favorite quotes from the book and some of my own reflections on what I've learned from Russ, his podcasts, his writings, and his book. So, what is a wild problem? Whether to have a child is what I call a wild problem. A fork in the road of life where knowing which path is the right one isn't obvious. Where the pleasure and pain from choosing one path over another are ultimately hidden from us. Where the path we choose defines who we are and who we might become. And his book was less of a how-to guide and more of a thoughtful contemplation for how to attack these problems. I wanted to share a few of my favorite parts of the book and definitely recommend buying it. I've included a link below. You can check it out. One thing I loved about his podcast over the years was that he took aim at his own profession. He was self-critical in terms of his own evolution of how early in his career, coming up through the University of Chicago economics program, he became so narrowly focused on numerical analysis and looking at the world through a quantitative lens. However, as he progressed through the podcast over the years and its own reflections, he saw that there's obviously much more to life. Things like dignity, passion, love, courage, all these things that can't really be quantified in economic analysis. Yet in today's world, so much is shaped by our belief that everything can be managed. Which is why I thought his book was a subtle provocation against this. Here's what he said. But wild problems resist measurement. What works for you might not work for me. And what worked for me yesterday might not work for me tomorrow. Wild problems are untamed, undomesticated, spontaneous, organic, complex. They're a whole different beast compared to the tame problems where the standard techniques of rationality move us steadily forward. I love this quote because it's sort of his conclusion from an entire career in economics and hundreds of conversations with some of the smartest people in the world. He's basically saying you have to figure your own life out. And I love this conclusion. It doesn't really give you an answer. Another part I liked is when he talked about marriage, and it resonated with my own experience getting married. Here's what he said. But the willingness of married people to share the experience of marriage is quite rare. First, it's intensely personal, intimate. Second, much of the time, we who are married may have little self-awareness of how marriage changes us. This is incredibly powerful. Why? Because we often are so good at figuring out what can go wrong in certain situations that we can quickly convince ourselves we shouldn't make changes, we shouldn't do things, we shouldn't embark on new chapters in our lives. Knowing this, that oftentimes we can't actually describe the true essence, the greatest things about experiencing life, we need to know that basically making bold changes or committing to things is an act of faith. We can't know all the good things, but we need to be aware there's often unknown upsides to many of the things we embark on in life. As he says in this quote, we would like to do the right thing. We would like to belong. We want a life well lived. We want to flourish. You can't anticipate what you're going to enjoy, and you certainly can't imagine some of the deeper pleasures that define us beyond the narrow day-to-day experiences of life. Start by facing your ignorance. Wild problems are not the kinds of problems with answers. The entire book is like this. It's saying, here's how you solve these wild problems, except you can't actually solve them. Sitting with this book is like having a deep conversation with a friend who really cares about wanting to make your life better. And just that experience, that felt sense of feeling that, okay, life is uncertain, but that's okay, was worth it. And I thought that was the best thing about the book. Another part I liked about this book was he gives the advice that maybe you should quit sometimes. I think far too often we go through life with these scripts in our head that we need to struggle, we need to persevere, we need to work through the hard things. He's sort of saying, well, maybe that's silly. And it sort of fits in with the overall message of the book, which is be humble. We don't know what we're supposed to be doing. There often isn't a right choice. And not committing can be just as big a mistake as overly committing. Here's what he writes. To know when to fold 'em and when to hold 'em is an art that is quantifiable in poker, but not in life. Better to learn who you are, your strengths and limitations, and make each decision as best you can. Here's a case where having rule always persevere or quit when it gets too hard will lead you astray. In life, knowing when to persevere and when to quit is a craft to cultivate. Sadly, we need to just go through the motions and make our own mistakes to figure this out. But bringing awareness to this fact that we're going to make mistakes can tell us that it's probably worth trying things, it's probably worth experimenting a little more, and it's probably worth reflecting to figure out how we can get better at this over time. Another thing I liked about this is that Russ really just reframes relationships. Over and over again throughout the book, he talks about how we have such a tendency to look at people that appear in our lives, people that appear in our work relationships, as people that can serve instrumental aims for us. We turn them into people that can help us facilitate transactions. I'll do something for you, you can do something for me. But often the best experiences in life, the best opportunities, emerge from playing non-zero-sum games. Here's another quote from Russ. Instead of entering a conversation with a fundamentally transactional plan, what can I get out of this? The star of the story mindset. Approach conversations more like an artist. Avoid having a set of goals. Rather than planning on steering the conversation, let it take its own path. The best conversations go in unexpected directions and end up in places of intimacy, revelation, or education. Overall, this book is an excellent contemplative companion for somebody that is curious about living a life well lived and wants to be challenged and wants to become more humble, more virtuous, and live a life that's more aligned with their true spirit. Highly recommend the book. Also recommend his podcast, Econ Talk. Overall, I've learned so much from Russ and am grateful that someone like him has shared his wisdom with us.